Hi students, and welcome to our world religions lesson, where today we consider again the question, has the Bible been corrupted? We saw yesterday in our lesson that one of the central claims of the Quran is that the Quran itself is a continuation of revelation, traveling from the Old Testament to the New Testament to the Quran. So one of the claims the Quran makes is that it is a continuation of revelation. Now, this is a massive issue for Muslim believers because the Old and New Testament both fundamentally contradict the message of Islam. Now, this is an issue because the Muslim needs to explain why it is that the message of the Old and New Testament are at odds with the Quran. How can all three of these documents be from God, from Allah, if the Old and New Testament contradict the Quran in foundational and fundamental ways? One of the key ways that Muslims try and get around this claim is by saying that the Old and New Testaments have been fundamentally corrupted. Is this the case? Well, that's what we're going to be considering today. Has the New Testament in particular become so corrupted that we can't know what its original message was? I'm going to assert that it has not been corrupted in that sense. The big idea we're going to see today is pretty basic. The New Testament has been reliably transmitted throughout history. And that's the big idea of today's lesson. So we're going to go through these notes here. You'll get a printout of all of these once we get back to school. So feel free to jot down notes, important ideas, and then you'll get these notes later. So don't feel like you need to write everything out by hand. But it will be helpful to note down some of the key and important ideas. So we saw that this claim by the Quran that the New Testament has been corrupted is a problematic claim for the Quran itself, because the Quran tells Christians to judge by our revelation whether or not the Quran is trustworthy. Now, this is a problem because if the Bible has been corrupted, why would the Quran say for Christians to judge by our scriptures? It doesn't make sense. So perhaps the Muslim might say, oh no, the New Testament became corrupted after the time of the Quran. Again, this causes issues for the Muslim believer because we have copies from the time of the Quran and from many hundreds of years before. So, let's start this reading today and consider some of these ideas. Starting with the third paragraph. When we ask the question, has the Bible been corrupted? We need to recognize that there are different definitions for the word corruption. In a technical sense, whenever a text is copied by hand, any variation whatsoever is considered a corruption. One spelling mistake, one added or missed word, these are technically corruptions. However, when Muslims talk about corruption of the Bible, they normally mean wholesale corruption to the point that we can no longer know what the original said. So the important thing to see here is that there are two kind of definitions for this word corruption. There's the technical definition. Whenever things copied by hand, any variation whatsoever is considered a corruption. So this is just the reality. Take, for example, let's say I gave all of you a copy of John's Gospel. Everyone in the year 10-11 class had to make a handwritten copy of John's Gospel. So you all take a few sheets of paper and you start writing out John's Gospel by hand. Now the reality is, every single student would make a mistake. There's no way that anyone would get John's Gospel copied perfectly. Any spelling mistake, any word order mistake, if someone writes Jesus but someone else writes Jesus Christ by accident, that is going to be, in a technical sense, what we call a corruption of the text. So this is something to be aware of. There's the technical sense in which any time a document is copied by hand, any variation whatsoever is, in this technical sense, considered a corruption. However, what we need to recognize is that often Muslims are functioning off a different definition of corruption. They normally mean wholesale corruption to the point that we can no longer know what the original said. Now, in this example I gave, say everyone in the class wrote out their own copy of John's Gospel. In fact, we don't even need the whole class. Let's just say 4 students wrote out a copy of John's Gospel. Now, there would definitely be mistakes. When I write things on my computer here, on my laptop, even though I'm in the 21st century, I've got technology, I can have good lighting in my house, I've got a keyboard. When I make mistakes, sometimes a red line comes underneath my words. I still make regular mistakes, even in things that I write and publish. So, copying by hand, there's no doubt people would make mistakes. Each of these would have mistakes in it. We'll just give them numbers: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's say, in this scenario, the original is lost. We no longer have John's Gospel. We only have these 4 copies, these 4 manuscripts. One of the questions we need to consider is, would we still be able to know what John originally wrote? We've lost John's Gospel, but can we know what John wrote from looking at these 4 copies? Now, someone might argue, they might protest and say, no, there's no way we could know what John wrote, because each of these 4 copies is going to be slightly different from one another. How do we know which copy to go with? For example, what if one of the copies says at one point, Jesus, and the other copies don't say Jesus, but they say the Lord Jesus? Now, in this sort of scenario, let's say number 1 made a mistake. They wrote Jesus, but the text should have said Jesus Christ. Now, what would be very unlikely is for all the other copies to make the mistake in the same place. In fact, it's unlikely that any of the other copies would make the same mistake in the same place. So what we can do is we can look at these, and we can see that all 3 of these all say Jesus Christ. Now, if we have a situation like this, it becomes obvious that this is a place in which number 1 made a mistake. When copying John's Gospel, they just wrote the word Jesus instead of the word Jesus Christ. The reason we're able to see that this is a mistake is because all the other copies say Jesus Christ. So it's very clear that this one here is the mistake. Now, it would become even more obvious if the whole class wrote a copy and we had 25 copies that said Jesus Christ and just this one that said Jesus. One of the things we notice is the more copies we have, the easier it is to detect mistakes. The more copies we have, the easier it is to detect mistakes. Okay, so let's carry on here in our reading. Since the New Testament is an ancient document that was copied by hand for 1500 years, there are, of course, differences in the copies. No one copies a manuscript perfectly. Furthermore, the more copies we have, the more differences there will be. The more copies we have, the more differences there will be. So, for example, let's say we look at each of these copies of John's Gospel and we ask, how many mistakes did each of these writers make? Let's say number 1 made 7 mistakes, number 2 made 4 mistakes, number 3 made 8 mistakes, and number 4 made 10 mistakes. Now, if this was going on and we had this kind of a situation, one of the things we still recognize is that the more copies we have, the easier it is to detect mistakes. But another thing that happens is the more copies we have, the more differences there will be, the more mistakes there will be. That's what this last sentence here is saying. Important to see that. Okay, let us continue reading here. What we must recognize is that having more copies is actually helpful because it allows us to determine the original more easily. If we only had one copy, we would have to have faith that the author copied everything exactly right. This is an important point to see. if we only had one copy, we would have to have faith that the author copied everything exactly right. Now, this is the issue we have here. Let's say we have John's Gospel. And let's say there is only one copy. And then we lose John's Gospel. How do we know where the mistakes are in this copy? Now, maybe if it was a spelling mistake, we might be able to detect that. Or maybe if there's clearly a word missed out, we might be able to detect that. But what about other things? What about the example we used in our first scenario? How would we know whether or not the copyist wrote Jesus Christ instead of Jesus, or Jesus instead of Jesus Christ? We can't really determine that, can we? Now, if we have two copies, we get a bit of a better idea. Where there's differences between the two copies, we can see that someone's made a mistake. But we can't know who, because it's a 50-50, it's a coin flip. The more copies we have, the easier it is to tell. If we only had one copy, we would have to trust that the author got everything right. Carrying on. The question we need to consider is this: has the Bible been so thoroughly corrupted that we can no longer know what it originally said? Muslim scholars will be quick to point out that there are around 400,000 textual variants. This phrase just means differences in the copies. Differences in the copies. 400,000 textual variants or corruptions, while there are only 138,000 words in the New Testament. So I've produced this chart to show us how that would be represented. Now, on the left here, this is how many words there are in the New Testament, 138,000. And the differences in the manuscripts, when we look at all the differences, all the textual variants, there is around, estimates say, 400,000. Now, the picture that is painted by this is that the Bible has been so thoroughly corrupted. Would you look at this? There's only 138,000 words, yet there are 400,000 textual variants. That means that there are almost 3 textual variants per word. And the Muslim will say, how can you possibly know what the original said when there are 300,000 textual variants per word? The idea is that there's 3 possibilities for each word in the New Testament, and we can't possibly know what the original said. Now, how would we deal with this kind of argumentation? How would we deal with this kind of objection? Well, that's what we're going to turn our attention to next. So, I'm going to suggest that this kind of presentation, this kind of graph where people suggest there are 3 possibilities per word in the New Testament, this is very misleading and dishonest. So, this kind of presentation of the facts is very misleading. This would make it appear as though there are 3 possibilities for each word in the New Testament. How could we possibly know what the authors originally meant if there are 3 possibilities for each word? However, this is not the case. An important fact to recognize is that 99% of all these variants are so insignificant that the difference in the text can't even be translated into English. Most of these differences are errors in spelling or word order that has no effect on meaning. And so one of the things to recognize is that so many of these mistakes, 99% of them, are so insignificant that they're almost immediately obvious. We can detect them straight away. This will be errors in spelling, word order. So in English, word order is very important for determining meaning. So in a basic sentence, I love food. Word order determines who the subject of the sentence is. what the object is well. So word order determines that in English. It is not the same in Greek. Word order is less significant in Greek. So the point to see here is that 99% of these textual variants are so insignificant that they don't even carry over into English. Of the remaining 1% of variants, only half of these are meaningful. So of the remaining 1% of variants, only half of these are meaningful. That is to say, half of the remaining 1% are variants that are mistakes that are very easy to catch and identify. So when we consider this information alongside the previous chart, we recognize that there are only about 1 to 2 meaningful variants per page of the New Testament. So there are only about 1 to 2 meaningful variants per page of the New Testament. So I've created a second chart to show this. Now, I think this is a better reflection of the situation we're dealing with. 138,000 words in the New Testament. Meaningful variants are about 2,000. Now, if you look at this chart, I think this reflects things better. This is the number of words in the New Testament. This tiny slither down here is how many meaningful variants there are. These are the variants where we need to pause and think about things and weigh things up and look at the evidence. We can still determine what the reading should be. However, these ones require a little bit more work. Now, as we compare this, we see that the New Testament is far more reliable than this initial graph would give it credit for. This is a dishonest representation. It's misleading because it doesn't reflect the reality that 99% of these variants are meaningless. Okay. So when we consider the number of copies of the New Testament in our possession, so over 2 million hand-copied pages. That's how many copies of the New Testament we have in our possession today. So from history, over 2 million hand-copied pages. The fact that there are so few meaningful textual variants is borderline miraculous. This is an important fact. The fact that there are so few meaningful textual variants is borderline miraculous. Thanks to the abundance of copies in our possession, Christian scholars can do the hard work of textual criticism to figure out what was originally written by the authors of the New Testament. So what scholars do and what textual critics do is they can look at all these copies and they can do this kind of process that we looked at the start. They can do this sort of thing, but on a much bigger scale with thousands of copies in order to determine the original. Now, like we said before, the more copies you have, the easier it is to determine the original. Scholars spend years and years studying this in order to be able to do this practice called textual criticism. Okay. Now, what I want to look at next is this chart here. I think this is a really great and helpful chart. This is a chart showing the transmissional reliability of the New Testament compared to other ancient texts. So what we have here is a bunch of ancient texts. We've got Plato, Herodotus, Demosthenes, Thucydides, Homer, Sophocles, Pliny, Caesar, and Tacitus. And then we have the New Testament over here. Now, in order to kind of understand this diagram a little bit, what we have is we have circles. So we've got these circles, and then we've got this diagram circle here. Now, just to help you understand these, the size of the circle represents how many copies of this person's writing we have from history. So the size of the circle, the bigger the circle, the more copies we have. Homer is the second biggest. That's big circle. Tacitus, we have very few copies. Here's a small circle. So that's what the size of the circle represents. The other thing to know in order to understand this diagram are these kind of arches at the back. Each of these represents 100 years. And the dot in the middle, right here in the middle, this represents the time when the document was written. So the question is, when was the document written? And the gap between when it was written and the circle is the time is how far between the original writing of the document and the earliest copy of the document we possess today. That's what that gap indicates. So this is when the document was written. The gap here indicates how many years between when it was written and the earliest copy of that document that we possess today. So let's have a look at some of these characters. Let's start down here with Tacitus. We see Tacitus over here on the chart. This helps us. There are 33 existing copies today of Tacitus. The gap time, the time between when it was written and the earliest copy we have, for Tacitus, it is 750 to 900 years. 750 to 900 years. And then we have the earliest copy of Tacitus that we possess today. Does that make sense? So the question is Tacitus reliable? Can we know what he said? Most historians would say yes, we can have a pretty good idea of what Tacitus said. We have 33 copies. That's good. That's helpful. We can compare them with one another to make these sorts of judgments. And the time gap, it's significant. It's 750 to 950 years. But we still think we can rely on what we read here. Let's try someone else. Let's try Plato. He's in the middle here. On our map, he's right at the top. Okay, you can see his circle is a bit bigger than Tacitus' circle. That's because we have 210 copies of Plato. We've got 210 copies of his writings. Now the time gap, however, for Plato, you'll see, is much bigger than the time gap for Tacitus. The time gap between when Plato was writing, which was before the time of the New Testament, to the earliest copies we have today, the time gap is 1,300 years. That's very significant. Again, the question is, can we rely on what we read from Plato? Yes, we have lots of copies. The time gap is significant, but through the practice of textual criticism, we think we can figure out what Plato was saying. Now, the kind of main competitor, the most historically reliable writing from antiquity next to the New Testament is Homer. Over here, Homer's Odyssey. You can see already his circle is the second biggest. Quite a big circle there. Now, the time gap, so the circle is big because we possess 1,757 copies, and the time gap for Homer is 400 years. So can we know what Homer said? Yes, we can compare those copies with one another, we can evaluate them, and we can try and figure out what he said. Now, let us turn our attention to the New Testament. Let us turn our attention to the New Testament. The first thing we notice is that this circle is so massive that it just dwarfs all the other circles. We've got two circles for the New Testament. They've broken it down like this to show this smaller circle. I say smaller, but it's still significantly bigger than all the others. This smaller circle represents copies of the New Testament that are in Greek, which is the original language of the New Testament. Okay, this bigger circle represents copies of the New Testament that have been translated into different languages. So, how does the New Testament compare in terms of reliability with other ancient writings? Well, first, how many copies do we have of the New Testament? First, notice we have 5,795 copies of the New Testament. That swamps Homer. The New Testament has far more copies than Homer. So that's just in the original language. That's not including translations. If we include translations, there are more than 23,000 copies. This is massive, massively reliable on that front. Okay, so we know there's lots and lots of copies. But how does the New Testament compare to these other documents in terms of the time gap? Well, what we see here is that compared to these other documents, the New Testament beats all of them on that front as well. The time gap between the writing of the New Testament and the earliest copies we have today is as little as potentially 40 years. This is massively significant. We have extremely early copies of the New Testament. So by this historic standard of measuring reliability of ancient documents, the New Testament far outweighs any other document in ancient history. So the question is, if the New Testament has been so thoroughly corrupted that we can't know what it originally said, then what that means is we really can't know anything about any of these characters throughout history, because they're all significantly less reliable than the New Testament. If we can't know anything about the New Testament or its original meaning, then we can't know anything about all of ancient history. Now, this is not the case. The reality is we can know much about ancient history, and we can know much about the New Testament. But compared to other documents of antiquity, the New Testament is significantly more reliable than these other documents. So, one of the questions to consider in light of this, we can see by these historic standards, the New Testament is extremely reliable. Now, one of the questions to consider is, we can do this as a thought experiment. If you took a time machine back 2,000 years and you were given a book, you're given some ancient papyrus, and you had to write out a story. So 2,000 years ago, you write out a story. Now, if you wanted that story to be passed on throughout history so that we could get to, so let's just say, AD 21. And you want to get that story communicated throughout history all the way to AD 2021. 2,000 years. You want your document to travel 2,000 years without being corrupted and changed, so that someone in 2021 can have the same story that you wrote in 21. How would you do it? Now, there's some different methods you might think of. Oh, maybe I'll just bury my copy in the sand and hopefully it'll be preserved through time. Very dangerous way of trying to protect your writing. Very easy, it could get destroyed by moths or bugs or moisture. That might not necessarily work. You might think, oh, I'll just pass it down through my family line. And every family can make a copy and pass it down that way. Now, again, this is problematic because what happens if people make changes to your story? What if someone adds a different ending? That different ending is going to be passed down to their kids and their kids. And then the story in 2021 might have a very different ending than your original story had in 21. So, what is a good method for transmitting a text across history? It's actually a tricky question. You can maybe carve it into a stone. There might be one way to preserve it, but that stone might even get destroyed. It's very tricky. Hopefully you see the problem. Now, the Christians and the Muslims have taken two different paths in terms of trying to come up with a method to protect their text. Christians have had a free transmission of the text whereas Muslims have had a controlled transmission. And what we're going to think about is this. How are texts transmitted through history? If you lived in the first century and you wrote a book that you wanted to be passed down for the next 2,000 years, what would be the most reliable way to transmit that book down through the centuries? Christians have used this, a freely transmitted text. And I don't think this was intentional. I think this was just a consequence of the way the New Testament was written. But it's important to have definitions for these two words, these two ideas, a controlled text and a freely transmitted text. A freely transmitted text is a text whose transmission is not controlled by an external authority such as a government or church. It is widely copied without restraints. Whereas a controlled text is one that is copied under the guidance of some external authority. Now, one of the great reasons why we can trust the reliability of the New Testament is because there was no point in history where someone could have come along and made wholesale changes to the New Testament. No one could just come along and say, so let's say we'll go John's Gospel again. Dozens and dozens of copies were made. John's Gospel spread out like wildfire across the ancient world. All these copies were made. And then from there, many more copies were made of those copies. All these people let their text be copied. And what happened was, eventually, throughout the history of time, John's Gospel, his original Gospel, was lost. We don't know where that is anymore. But all these copies still existed. Now, there was no point in time. Let's say you wanted to change John's story. You wanted to add something in. So you go, I know, I'm going to, in my copy, I'm going to put a big change in John's Gospel. I'm going to say something very different. And hopefully, in the future, John's Gospel will be very different because of my change. Is that going to work? Well, obviously not, because all these hundreds, eventually thousands of copies are going to be different to your copy. And people can compare them and go, uh-oh, he made a mistake right here. It looks like he tried to add in his own bit. We're going to ignore it. We're going to take it out of the text. A freely transmitted text is safer because it protects itself from changes being introduced to the text. So that's what we see with a freely transmitted text. The alternative is to have a controlled text. But the important thing to note is there was no point in history where someone goes, you know what, I'm going to make the new official version of John's Gospel. This here is going to be the new version of John's Gospel, and I'm going to collect up all the copies that came before me. I'm going to collect up all of them and burn them. That way, everyone's going to have to use my copy from now on. That could never happen. There's never a point in church history where someone had that sort of power. What we're going to see in a future lesson is that the Quran initially started spreading out like this, but then later on they had an official version made by a guy named Uthman. What he did was he collected up all the previous copies and he had them destroyed. Now, for the Muslim, the problem is you have to trust that Uthman got everything right. If Uthman made a mistake, there's no way to know, because you cannot compare what Uthman wrote with earlier copies because they're all destroyed. We're going to explore that in a later session, but hopefully for now, this helps you to grow in your confidence that the New Testament is indeed extremely, extremely reliable. In fact, I think it's safe to say that the New Testament is the most reliable document in antiquity. God bless you, and I'll see you later. Bye.